Why was everyone laughing at her? That was the first thing she noticed, the quiet, polished laughter that carried across the firing range like the sound of glass cracking in the heat. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. The kind of laughter that told her she didn't belong here. Eva Rostova stood at the edge of the White Sands Advanced Weapons Facility, a Marine in a desert of Navy uniforms and civilian engineers. Her own uniform looked older, sun-bleached and worn, a ghost of the countless places it had been dragged through. The others looked immaculate, as if even the desert respected their pressed collars. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. The laughter came from one man in particular, Commander Davies. His stance was a sculpture of arrogance, hands on his hips, chin up, chest forward. The kind of man who mistook confidence for competence and uniform polish for honor. He spoke to her like a teacher, explaining something to a student who shouldn't have been allowed in the classroom. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he said, "this is a naval facility for precision ordnance. We deal with billion-dollar systems, not iron sights and Kentucky windage." The crowd chuckled again, emboldened by their commander's tone. Engineers from Lockheed, technicians from Raytheon, people who worshiped data, circuitry, and computation. To them, she was a relic, an analog instrument in a digital cathedral. Davies gestured toward the endless expanse of white desert. "This is where trajectories are plotted to the micron," he continued. "This isn't some sandbox field shoot. We're validating a $90 million targeting system today." His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Your presence here is a courtesy to the Marine Liaison Office, nothing more." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of ozone from the radar domes. Eva said nothing, not a twitch, not a single reaction. Her face remained neutral, a silent mask carved from iron. And that silence made him nervous. People like Commander Davies were used to noise. They thrived on compliance, on acknowledgement. Silence was a void, and voids made insecure men talk more. He pointed at the battered Pelican rifle case at her feet. "I'm sure that piece has served you well wherever you've been playing, Sergeant, but today—" He didn't finish. Because in the observation tower high above them, General Caldwell, a four-star Marine with a face like weathered granite, leaned forward. His eyes narrowed as he studied the woman below. He wasn't listening to Davies. He wasn't impressed by his performance. He was watching her. He saw the balance in her stance. The way her eyes weren't focused on the commander but on the horizon, scanning instinctively, reading wind patterns in the shimmer of heat, tracking the subtle bend of the sparse desert grass. She wasn't posturing. She was preparing. And in that stillness, Caldwell saw something familiar. A memory, buried but unforgotten, of a shot, long ago, in a valley no one talked about anymore. A shot that had changed everything. He lifted the range radio. "Range control," his gravel voice crackled. "Hold the test, power down the line." A hush fell over the facility. Davies froze mid-sentence, blinking up toward the observation tower. What the hell? He could see only his own reflection in the tinted glass. Below, the desert heat rippled, and Eva knelt slow, deliberate, to unlatch her rifle case. Not in deference, not for show, just purpose. Each latch opened with a deep, satisfying click. And as she lifted the lid, the sunlight caught on dark walnut and oiled steel. A weapon that didn't belong in a place obsessed with drones and digital optics. The M210. Old, scarred, but alive. The kind of rifle that didn't need to look dangerous to be feared. A murmur went through the crowd. The general's voice rolled across the range speakers like thunder over distant sand. "Commander Davies," he said, "the sergeant will take the first shot." For a moment time stopped. The words hung heavy in the air, absurd, impossible, defiant. Davies turned red, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Sir, this is a live validation test. We can't." "Commander," the the general cut him off, voice sharp as a blade. "You will stand down and give the sergeant whatever she requires. Is that understood?" The silence that followed felt alive, pressing on every chest, crawling through the still desert air. Even the wind held its breath. Eva didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the order or the stares. She simply laid out a worn canvas mat with the kind of calm that unnerved everyone watching. Her movements were fluid, no hesitation, no waste. She wasn't performing, she was operating. Davies tried to salvage his dignity, forcing a laugh as he walked over. "Sergeant," he said with mock concern, "you do understand this is over 1.5 miles, right? Crosswinds are shearing at 12 knots. We're dealing with updraft from the canyon, barometric drop, spin drift, things you can't possibly account for by." He stopped, because she wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, that same 1,000-yard stare that saw the invisible dance of the world itself. In her hand, a small kestrel wind meter spun lazily, but it wasn't the numbers she cared about. It was what the land was telling her. The subtle shimmer of heat, the pattern of dust swirls, the whisper of the desert. She opened a small, leather-bound notebook, her data book. The thing looked ancient, its pages filled with hand-scribbled notes and faded marks. To the engineers, it was laughable. Pencil and paper in the age of satellites. Davies scoffed. "Sergeant, this is absurd. You're delaying a critical test." Eva finally turned. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw them, pale gray, cold as the edge of a blade, calm in a way that was almost unsettling. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Understood." Then she turned back to her rifle. That was it, no defiance, no explanation, just acknowledgement and dismissal. It was the kind of silence that made arrogant men feel small. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a single cartridge, hand-loaded, brass dull with age but polished by care. She rolled it between her fingers, a ritual, not a gesture. With one motion, she chambered it. The metallic thud echoed like a gavel in the desert stillness. The entire facility seemed to freeze. Engineers leaned forward. Officers stopped whispering. Even the cameras stopped panning. The world narrowed to her, the rifle and the horizon. For Eva Rostova there was no audience, no range, no commander. There was only process. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Her body settled into the earth. The rifle became an extension of her heartbeat, every pulse aligning with the rhythm of patience. Thump. Thump. Pause. It was in that pause that everything disappeared. Her eyes behind the scope weren't searching for the target. They were reading the air itself, the unseen language of mirage and light. At 2,500 meters, wind wasn't just wind. It was terrain, a river she had to cross. She watched it twist, curl, flatten. She saw the canyon's heat shimmer bend upward. The updraft Davies had bragged about reading on a screen. She didn't need a screen. Her pencil moved across the notebook. Numbers, corrections, elevation angles. Her handwriting was small, steady. She had done this so many times her hand didn't tremble anymore. She adjusted her scope. The clicks were crisp, final, each one a decision she would never question. Up 36.5 minutes elevation. Left 7.25 minutes for drift. Her breathing slowed. The desert exhaled with her. Her finger rested on the trigger guard, not yet touching, not yet claiming that moment. In her mind, she replayed the sound of a single heartbeat, the one moment of stillness between life and motion. And then, she pressed. Not pulled. Not jerked. Pressed. The rifle spoke. A sharp, controlled crack that ripped through the dry air, echoing off canyon walls like thunder behind glass. Then silence. The bullet was gone, invisible, already halfway through a journey across 1.5 miles of nothingness. For everyone else, it was over in a blink. But to her, it was a moment suspended in time, a tiny piece of lead carving through air, wrestling with wind, gravity, and the turning of the earth itself. 3.5 seconds. That's how long it took. 3.5 seconds of silence, so deep you could hear your own pulse. Davy stood with his arms crossed, the smirk already forming. He had seen shots like this fail 1,000 times in simulations. He was ready to declare the obvious. And then, clang! A thin, lonely metallic note carried on the wind. It was faint, but everyone heard it. The engineers turned. The technicians froze. Every eye went to the digital display board. The numbers flickered, processing. Then they appeared. Hit target center. Deviation, 0.75 millimeters. Silence, total, breathless, disbelieving silence. Davy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His world, everything he thought he knew, had just been dismantled by a single shot. She didn't celebrate, didn't look up. Eva Rostova simply opened her rifle, ejected the brass casing, and caught it midair, not out of vanity, but out of habit. The crowd erupted in whispers, disbelief, awe. But she was already packing up. Because for her, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving that the fundamentals, the discipline, the quiet process, still mattered in a world that worshipped shortcuts. The only thing that broke her stillness was the wind. It carried the faint echo of the shot long after the range went silent again. He didn't believe it. Commander Davies just stood there, jaw slack, mind blank, the desert heat shimmering around him like a mirage. The laughter that had once filled the range was gone, swallowed by a silence so absolute it pressed against the chest. For the first time in his career, the commander had no words. The crowd didn't move. Not the engineers, not the officers, not even the technicians who'd been whispering moments earlier. Their faces were turned toward the digital board that glowed with impossible data. Hit target center, 0.75 deviation. It was a number no one wanted to believe. It wasn't just a hit, it was surgical perfection. At 2.5 kilometers, that deviation was the difference between miracle and myth. A quiet voice crackled from the tower speaker. Range control, confirm target data. There was a pause, static, then the voice of a young technician trembling. Confirmed, sir. Target impact center. She hit it dead on. That's when the murmurs began. Low, hushed, uncertain. A room full of scientists trying to find math for something that wasn't supposed to happen. General Caldwell lowered his binoculars slowly. He wasn't surprised. Not really. What he felt was something heavier, familiar, a kind of reverence that came only when witnessing mastery. He turned toward his aide. "Get me her record," he said softly, "now." Down on the line, Eva Rostova moved with quiet, deliberate rhythm, cleaning her rifle, brushing a fine layer of dust from its walnut stock, disassembling the bolt with practiced ease. Each motion was precise, patient, and strangely intimate. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't need to. For her, the shot was already done. The noise, the disbelief, that was theirs to deal with, not hers. Davy's boots crunched against the gravel as he walked toward her. His movements were slow, almost dazed. The arrogance that had filled every word earlier had drained from him, leaving something hollow and human in its place. He opened his mouth, but the words died halfway. What could he even say? Nice shot. It felt insulting. Above them, the tower doors opened with a heavy metallic groan. All heads turned as General Caldwell descended the steel stairs, his frame cutting a dark silhouette against the blinding sky. He didn't rush. Each step echoed, a measured rhythm that matched the pounding of Davy's heart. The crowd parted instinctively. No one dared to speak. When the general reached the line, he didn't look at Davies. He didn't have to. He stopped a few feet from Eva Rostova. She looked up, her expression calm, unreadable. "General," she said quietly. He studied her face, the faint sunburn across her cheeks, the lines of exhaustion under her eyes, a face that had seen distance, wind, loss, a face shaped by years in the kind of silence that only those who have fired real shots understand. He nodded once. "Captain," he said to his aide, "pull up her record, display it on the main board." A ripple of confusion spread across the line. Davies blinked. "Sir, is that necessary?" "Do it," Caldwell said, his tone flat as stone. Moments later, the massive display screen, still glowing with the shot data, flashed, the numbers vanishing, replaced by a simple black screen and a single name in white text. Sergeant Eva S. Rostova, United States Marine Corps. The data began to scroll. The aide, a young officer barely out of his 20s, hesitated as the words appeared. His voice trembled as he read. Sergeant Eva Rostova, Primary MOS, 317 Scout Sniper. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Even among military personnel, those two words carried weight. Scout Sniper, the quiet elite, the ones who vanished into the world's edges and returned with a single, perfect result. The aide continued reading. Graduate Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Honor Graduate. Graduate, Scout Sniper School, Quantico, Honor Graduate and recipient of the Carlos Hathcock Award for High Shooter. That name, Hathcock, landed like a thunderclap. To anyone who knew history, it was sacred. The ghost of the Marine sniper whose shots had defined generations. The award bearing his name wasn't given. It was earned through perfection that bordered on myth. The crowd fell silent again. The screen kept scrolling. Specialized training, high-angle marksmanship, urban sniper course, target interdiction course, Seer School. The list kept going, longer, harsher, heavier with every line. Then came the deployments. Combat deployments, 7. Operation Enduring Freedom 3 Tour. Operation Iraqi Freedom 2 Tour. Operation Inherent Resolve 2 Tour. Someone in the back whispered, 7 Tour, Jesus. The aide swallowed hard and continued. Assigned units, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, MARSOC. Another murmur, this time from the Navy officers. Even they understood what that meant. MARSOC wasn't a posting, it was an ascension. Caldwell stood motionless as the screen kept rolling. His face didn't move, but his eyes said everything. The same look a man gets when the ghosts of old wars come to stand beside him. Finally, the aide reached the awards. His voice cracked. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 3 awards, Purple Heart, 3 times, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor, Presidential Unit Citation. He stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. Davies' breath hitched. Every word on that screen carved deeper into his pride. His face burned under the weight of what he was realizing, that this woman, this quiet Marine he'd dismissed, had lived a dozen lifetimes in the spaces he'd only studied. When the scrolling stopped, the general finally spoke. His voice carried like gravel on wind. "Commander," he said, turning toward Davies, "assumptions are the mother of all failures. You assumed rank meant skill. You assumed technology replaced instinct. And you assumed you could recognize a warrior when you saw one." Caldwell's tone hardened. "You were wrong." The words hit harder than any reprimand could. Davies' mouth opened, but his throat refused sound. The general didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to Eva Rostova, his posture straightening, the air around him seeming to grow heavy with ceremony. And then he did something no one expected. He saluted her. A 4-star general saluting a sergeant. It wasn't a casual salute. It was sharp, deliberate, absolute. A gesture of respect so profound it shattered protocol like glass. Every person on that line knew what they were seeing. He said quietly, "Sergeant Rostova, Your demonstration today was a masterclass. Thank you for reminding us what a Marine is capable of." She held his gaze, then returned the salute. "Thank you, sir." The general dropped his hand, turned, and walked away. Not another word. Davies just stood there, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. His throat burned with the bitter taste of humiliation, but beneath it, something else began to stir. Respect. Real, raw, reluctant respect. He looked back at her, this quiet woman packing up her rifle, no pride, no victory grin, just quiet professionalism. And it dawned on him. She hadn't come here to prove him wrong. She'd come here to do what she always did, her job. Hours later, when the sun sank behind the dunes and the range fell into long shadows, the story had already begun to spread. It started with the technicians, then the engineers, then the Navy officers, the pilots, the base staff. By nightfall, everyone was whispering the same thing: the Marine sniper who beat the system. They called her the ghost shot. They said she'd hit steel at 2,500 meters with an old rifle and a notebook. The engineers who'd witnessed it printed the data sheet and pinned it to the workshop corkboard, right next to their billion-dollar schematics. The legend was being born quietly like her. And yet in her barracks, Eva Rostova sat alone, cleaning her weapon in silence, the smell of gun oil and dust filling the air. Her hands moved automatically: wipe, inspect, reassemble. The rhythm was comforting, a ritual that kept her centered. She wasn't thinking about what they'd say. She wasn't replaying the general's salute. She was thinking about wind, distance, the faint shimmer of heat above the sand. Because tomorrow there'd be another range, another target, another silence to fill. In the end, that was her gift, not the shot, not the fame, but the lesson she never had to explain. Perfection isn't noise, it's quiet. It's earned in silence, long before the trigger breaks. And sometimes, the loudest statement in the world is a single perfect shot. The story spread faster than any official report could ever travel. By dawn, it was everywhere. In the mess hall, whispers drifted between coffee cups and half-eaten trays. In the barracks, someone retold it for the 10th time, adding details that weren't there but somehow felt true. At the officers' club, where the air always smelled faintly of whiskey and polished brass, even the pilots had stopped talking long enough to listen. They called it the shot that silenced the range. Every retelling grew a little more mythic. Some said she never blinked. Others swore she'd calculated the shot in her head faster than the supercomputer could. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that it had happened, and that everyone on that range had heard the metallic clang that proved it. But while the legend was being built in whispers, Eva Rostova was already gone from the spotlight. She didn't linger, didn't attend the after-action meetings or the technical debriefs. When the crowd dispersed, she gathered her gear, packed her case, and disappeared into the quiet edges of the facility, leaving the world to debate the impossible. In her mind, there was nothing to celebrate. A shot, no matter how perfect, was still just a shot. Perfection wasn't a destination, it was maintenance. It had to be tended to, like a fire that refused to stay lit. And so, while her name spread like desert wind through the facility, Eva sat alone in a dim maintenance bay, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. She had the rifle disassembled on a clean white cloth, its pieces lined in perfect order like a ritual altar. Her fingers moved automatically, but her thoughts were far away. She thought of the first time she'd ever made a shot beyond 1,000 meters, a hillside in Helmand Province, wind in her face, hands trembling. Her spotter had whispered, "Don't aim for the man. Aim for what you believe you can do." She had squeezed the trigger then, not for glory, not for approval, but because there was no other choice. Because someone downrange needed her to be steady when the world was. She learned early that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, it was cold, it was discipline under fire. The echo of those lessons was what carried her now. Upstairs, in the cool, air-conditioned halls of the operations wing, Commander Davies couldn't escape the silence that followed him. Every corridor he walked felt longer, every greeting more restrained. His subordinates, once eager to impress him, now avoided his gaze. Their respect hadn't just faded, it had been transferred. To her, he sat in his office, the walls closing in. The data from the test replayed endlessly on his monitor. Each time the muzzle flash lit up on screen, his stomach tightened. He could hear his own voice in his memory, patronizing, certain, ignorant. He hated that voice now. It was strange, he thought, how arrogance sounded so different when you listened to it after the truth. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paused frame of the rifle discharging. The brass casing was still midair, caught in perfect freeze frame. The expression on her face, calm, unflinching, haunted him. He'd spent years believing leadership was command, authority, rank. But what he'd seen that day had dismantled that illusion in seconds. Authority wasn't granted. It was earned in silence, proven through action. And she had done it without saying a single damn word. He opened a drawer, pulling out the after-action report template. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, but he didn't type. What could he write? A sergeant demonstrated perfection. The words sounded too small, too sterile. He closed the laptop and pressed his palms together. He wasn't angry anymore. He was ashamed. Meanwhile, the general's order had already gone out. The technicians scoured the desert for hours until one of them found it. A single spent brass casing half buried in the sand, dulled by the wind, still warm from the sun. They cleaned it, polished it, but didn't erase the small scratches left by the ejection. Caldwell wanted those scars to stay. He ordered a display built, a simple, elegant stand of teak and brushed steel. At its center, the casing stood upright under glass. No fanfare, no title, just a single engraved plaque beneath it. The standard 2,500 meters, one round. This is what right looks like. The display was placed in the lobby of the command building, where every officer, contractor, and visitor would pass it on their way in. It said nothing, but it spoke louder than anything else on base. Some stopped to look. Most didn't at first, but eventually everyone did. And when they did, they fell quiet, because somehow that small piece of brass carried more authority than all their badges combined. Commander Davies stood before it one evening, long after the lobby had emptied. The fluorescent lights hummed. The glass over the display glinted faintly in the quiet. He didn't move for a long time. When he finally did, it wasn't to leave, it was to whisper. I was wrong. The words barely escaped his throat, rough and broken. But once they were out, they seemed to lift something heavy off his shoulders. That night, he made a decision. He couldn't undo his arrogance, but he could learn from it. He started showing up to the training ranges, not to lecture but to listen. He stood beside the junior sailors, asked questions of the enlisted men, and admitted when he didn't know the answer. At first, they didn't know what to make of it, but soon they saw it for what it was. Humility. And like all real changes, it started quiet. Eva didn't see any of that. She didn't need to. She moved on to a smaller range on the edge of the facility, where no one went unless they had to. She preferred it that way. No observers, no eyes, no applause. There, under the same blistering sun, she trained a young Marine corporal, barely 20, trembling behind the rifle, too eager to impress. His shots missed by feet, then by inches, then by less. She never raised her voice, never criticized, just corrected softly. Breathe with the wind, don't fight it, it's not your enemy, it's your guide. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow, too nervous to look her in the eye. Sergeant, how do you do it? He asked. That shot, everyone's talking about it. What's the secret? Eva paused, her gaze drifting to the distant dunes. The wind carried faint whispers of heat, the same silence that had followed her shot. "There's no secret," she said. "You master the fundamentals. You do them right every single time until you can't get them wrong." She turned back to him, her tone soft but steady. "Respect the process. The rest is noise." He blinked, unsure what to say, but the words stuck, simple, clear, permanent. Later, as she packed her gear and the sun began to sink, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The base had changed. She could feel it, not in the way people looked at her, but in the quiet itself. The laughter that had once filled the firing lines was gone, replaced by something else. Respect, focus, silence. And she realized something profound. Sometimes change doesn't come from orders or speeches. Sometimes it comes from a single act so undeniable, it rewrites the room. Far across the base, in his dim office, Commander Davies watched the same desert sunset through his window. He thought of her words, her silence, the way she'd looked at him without judgment, without superiority, just calm acceptance. He whispered to himself, competence doesn't announce itself, it just acts. For the first time in years, he felt like he understood leadership. Not the kind printed on walls or PowerPoint slides, but the kind carried in silence, lived through action, proven in pressure. The casing glowed faintly under the last rays of the desert sun, a tiny monument to humility and precision. And if you stood there long enough, watching that single shell under glass, you could almost hear it again, the faint echo of the rifle that had fired it, and the woman who never needed to say a word. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. End of part 3, ~1, 580 words. Would you like me to continue directly into part 4, where we explore the lasting cultural shift her shot creates on the base, how her quiet professionalism reshapes others, and how even those who never met her begin to feel her presence? You said. 4. ChatGPT said. Perfect, continuing seamlessly into part 4 of your cinematic, emotionally grounded, voiceover-ready narrative of Commander hit her face, then realized too late what a Marine sniper can actually do. This chapter unfolds in the aftermath of change, how one woman's silent act begins to reshape an entire culture, one person, one moment, one small decision at a time. It's introspective, human, and quietly powerful. Part 4, cinematic narrative continues. At first, no one noticed the change. Not really. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with orders or memos or speeches. It slipped in quietly, between the hours, between the routines, between the cracks of pride and certainty. But over time, White Sands began to feel different. The laughter on the range became rarer, not because humor had died, but because arrogance had. The technicians who once boasted about precision began double-checking their readings, not out of fear, but respect. The officers who once spoke in clipped, confident jargon started asking questions instead of issuing proclamations. It was subtle but undeniable. The ripple had started from that single perfect shot, and now it was moving through everything, like wind reshaping sand. They called it the Rostova Standard. No one knew who coined it first. Some said it came from the engineers. Others swore it started with the Navy captain who replaced Davies, but it spread fast, and once it took root, it stayed. A Rostova Standard meant one thing: do it perfectly, silently, without excuse. On the range, if a technician's calibration hit dead center on the first attempt, someone would smile and say, "You pulled a Rostova." If a junior Marine solved a problem without bragging, they'd say, "She'd approve." Her name became shorthand for excellence without ego. And the most powerful thing, she wasn't even there anymore. Eva Rostova had been reassigned a week after the incident. No ceremony, no goodbye, just quiet orders as always. She packed light, always did. Her rifle case, her worn notebook, a small photo of her platoon, the only personal item she kept. She left before dawn, her transport lifting off in a swirl of desert dust. By the time the base woke up, she was gone. But her presence stayed behind, like the lingering echo of a bell that had already stopped ringing. General Caldwell felt it most of all. In his decades of service, he had seen men break, rise, fail, and rebuild. But what Eva had done, what she had reminded them of, struck deeper than tactics or marksmanship. It touched the moral fiber of leadership itself. He found himself standing in front of the brass casing display almost every evening now. Not to admire it, but to remember. He would look at the faint scratches on the metal and think about every briefing he'd sat through, every officer who'd spoken more than they'd listened, every soldier whose quiet excellence had gone unseen. And every time the thought came back to him like a whisper, respect is earned in silence. He'd begun ending his briefings differently. No more long speeches, no more promises. Just one sentence, spoken with deliberate calm. Remember the standard. Everyone knew what he meant. In another wing of the facility, Commander Davies' old office now belonged to Captain Monroe, a sharp, no-nonsense Navy officer who had been chosen precisely because she wasn't afraid of truth. She'd read every file, every report, every classified note about that day. And when she stood at the window overlooking the range, she felt a strange kind of reverence, not for the shot itself, but for what it represented. On her first day addressing the full staff, she said something that no one expected. "I'm not here to be the loudest in the room. I'm here to listen and to make sure the right voices are heard." Then she pointed to the lobby display. "That casing, that's not a trophy, it's a mirror. It's a reminder of who we should be when no one's watching." Silence followed her words, not the uneasy kind but the respectful kind. The kind that meant people understood. Meanwhile, Davies himself had found his own quiet penance. He'd requested transfer, not out of shame, but necessity. He couldn't stay where every corner reminded him of his failure. The Navy reassigned him to a staff position at the Pentagon, logistics, planning, oversight. A world away from the dust and heat of the desert. But he carried the desert with him. On his desk he kept a small framed photo, not of family, not of friends. Just that brass casing, taken from a printed news memo someone had mailed him anonymously. Beneath it, handwritten in blue ink, were 3 words. "Assumptions kill truth." He looked at it every morning before his briefings, a silent ritual. And little by little, his arrogance melted into something better, clarity. He became known for something rare in the Pentagon halls, humility. He asked for advice from those beneath him. He credited his team before himself. He listened. People noticed. And when they asked why, he always said the same thing quietly. "I met someone once. She changed how I measure competence." He never said her name. He didn't need to. Back at White Sands, the story became something larger than memory. It became training material. The data from her shot was included in simulation exercises, not as legend, but as reference. New recruits studied it to understand environmental variables, but the instructors always added the same note. The math matters, but the mindset matters more. It became part of doctrine. Her calm became policy. Her silence became instruction. And without ever meaning to, she had changed an institution built on noise. Every month on the anniversary of that shot, someone placed a single bullet casing beside the display in the lobby. Never the same one twice, never announced. Just a quiet tradition that no one claimed and everyone respected. Some said it was the maintenance crew. Others said it was the general himself, but it didn't matter who. What mattered was why. Because that single, perfect shot had taught them something sacred. That technology might advance, but discipline doesn't age. That software can calculate, but instinct interprets. That you can't automate the human heart. One evening, long after most had gone home, a young technician paused before the display. He had joined the facility 6 months after Eva's departure. He never met her, never even heard her voice, but he'd studied her file, memorized her numbers, replayed the video of the shot until it felt personal. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the light catch the brass. His friend walked up behind him. "You really believe all that happened exactly like they say?" He smiled faintly. "I don't know, doesn't matter if it did." "Then why do you keep looking at it?" He turned toward the glass, his reflection faint beside the casing. "Because it reminds me that perfection's possible, even once, even for 1 second." The other man nodded slowly. "You think she knows what she started?" The technician looked out toward the range, where the night wind moved like a living thing across the sand. "No," he said, "and that's probably why she's who she is." Thousands of miles away, under a different sun, Eva Rostova walked alone across another range, one she couldn't name, somewhere deep in the restricted zones of another country. The terrain was different, but the silence was the same. She could still feel the rhythm of that day, the weight of the rifle, the steadiness of her breath, the faint tremor of heat above the barrel. But she didn't think about the record she'd set or the respect she'd earned. She thought about the lesson she'd learned and left behind. In a world obsessed with being seen, she had proven the power of being unseen. She had shown that greatness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It simply exists, pure, focused, disciplined. She stopped for a moment, kneeling to check the dirt. A faint breeze crossed her cheek, whispering across the land like a memory. It carried with it the ghost of that desert, that shot, that silence. She smiled faintly, then stood up, lifted her rifle, and kept walking. Back at White Sands, the casing gleamed faintly in the dark, the engraved words catching the last flicker of fluorescent light. The standard 2,500 meters, one round. This is what right looks like. And though no one could hear it, the silence around it spoke volumes. Because everyone who passed by knew what it meant. That discipline is louder than ego. That excellence doesn't need applause. That the greatest warriors often speak in whispers. And that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing at all. How far can silence travel? Thousands of miles away, in a desert half a world from White Sands, the wind carried no sound of laughter, only grit, heat, and the distant thump of helicopter rotors fading into a bleeding sunset. Eva Rostova moved through that silence like it was home. Different sand, same stillness. Different mission, same weight. Her temporary reassignment had turned permanent. Officially, she was attached to a joint operations unit. Unofficially, nobody asked questions. The kind of missions where names vanished into code numbers, where outcomes were briefed in rooms without windows. She didn't mind. She had learned long ago that anonymity was a gift. The convoy halted in a shallow wadi. The air shimmered with late-day heat. Every movement looked like it happened underwater. The team dismounted, 8 of them, faces hidden behind scarves and mirrored goggles. Special forces, quiet professionals. But even among them, she was the quietest. The team leader, Major Keene, crouched over the map projected on his tablet. "Target compound is here," he said, tapping a blinking red dot. "High-value individual, we're overwatch only. No direct action unless I give the word." He looked at her. "Rostova, your hide's here, 2.8 clicks north-northeast. You'll have eyes on the courtyard. If it moves, you see it first." She nodded once. No questions, no commentary. Keene studied her for a moment, uneasy. He'd heard stories everyone had, but legends don't breathe, and this woman did. Still, There was something in the calm of her movements that made even him lower his voice. "Rules of engagement are tight," he said. "We're not here to start a war, copy." "Copy," she replied. And then she was gone, slipping into the landscape like smoke. By nightfall she had built her hide on a ridge of black rock. The world below was a map of moonlight and shadow. Through her scope, the compound looked peaceful, almost domestic. Laundry lines, a few generators, 2 dogs sleeping by a gate. But she knew better. Places like this were always quiet before the storm. She settled into position. The M210 lay in front of her, steady on its bipod, the same old rifle that had silenced White Sands. Its wood was worn smooth against her gloves. She opened her notebook, marked the wind, distance, temperature. The same ritual, the same rhythm, but tonight the silence was heavier. It carried consequences. Hours passed. Stars wheeled overhead. The radio whispered static and short bursts of code. At 200, the compound came alive. Headlights, doors, figures moving quickly, armed men escorting someone out. Her reticle found him instantly, tall, clean-shaven, wrapped in white robes, the target. Her finger rested against the trigger guard, not yet inside. She could end it now. One breath, one heartbeat. The world would shift. But Keen's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. "Hold, repeat, hold. We need confirmation from command." She breathed out, waited. Through her scope she saw something strange. A child, small, barefoot, running from one building to another, clutching a bundle of papers. The man reached down, took the child's hand, led him gently back inside. Eva's jaw tightened. "Command, this is Overwatch 1, Keen whispered. "Target is positive, but there's collateral risk, awaiting go order." Static answered. Then the cold voice of an operations officer miles away. "Go order confirmed. Execute." Silence. No one moved. Keen's voice was low, uncertain. "Overwatch 1, you're clear." Eva's finger slid onto the trigger. Her crosshairs hovered over the man's chest, steady, perfect. But the child reappeared, standing beside him, eyes wide in the light spilling from the open door. She exhaled half a breath, then froze. "You master the fundamentals, you respect the process, the rest is noise." Her own words came back to her like ghosts. Killing was not the process. Precision was, judgment was. And sometimes, the most precise act was to not act at all. Her finger eased off the trigger. She whispered, "Negative shot, collateral presence." Keen's reply came sharp, "Say again." She repeated, calm and certain, "Negative shot, child in proximity, recommend abort." Command came back cold, "That's not your call, Sergeant." She didn't answer. She shifted the rifle 2 inches, recalculated, remeasured, found an angle that cleared the child. But now the man had stepped into the shadows. Gone. Too late. "Target lost," she said. Static silence, then Keen's exhale, "Copy." They exfiltrated before dawn, ghosting through ravines under fatting stars. No one spoke until they reached the extraction zone. The air was thick with tension. At the LZ, Keen finally turned to her. "You disobeyed a direct order." Eva looked at him. "I followed the standard." He frowned. "The what?" She glanced toward the horizon, where the sun was bleeding into the dust. "The right shot, the clean shot, that's the standard." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You just let a man walk who's killed hundreds." She locked eyes with him. "And I didn't kill a child, we'll get another chance." "He won't." He wanted to argue, but couldn't. There was something in her voice, that same calm conviction that made lesser men fall silent. 2 weeks later, intelligence confirmed it. The target resurfaced, same compound, same routine, but this time without family present. Another team took the shot, clean, contained, no collateral. Keen didn't send her a message. He didn't need to, she already knew. In the official report, the notation was brief. Overwatch 1 withheld fire due to non-combatant interference. Decision later validated. No reprimand, no praise. Just fact. But inside the unit, something changed. The men and women who doubted her now looked differently at the quiet Marine who defied orders for principle. Because they'd all seen what restraint looked like under pressure. And they understood that mastery wasn't just in the trigger pull, it was in knowing when not to pull. That night, as she cleaned her rifle under the pale light of a single lantern, Keene approached. He stood there awkwardly, helmet in hand. "You were right," he said quietly. She didn't look up. About what? About the standard. She paused, slid the bolt back into place, and finally met his gaze. "It's not mine," she said. "It belongs to anyone willing to earn it." He nodded, unsure how to reply. Then, before walking away, he said something that stuck with her for the rest of her life. "You know, silence isn't the absence of courage, it's proof of it." For the first time in days, she smiled. A small, tired, genuine smile. Months later, she would return stateside. Another anonymous flight, another silent arrival, no medals, no speeches. But back at White Sands, her legend had grown again. Not for the shot that hit, but for the one she refused to take. The engineers added a new line beneath the brass casing's plaque. "Perfection is not the shot you make, it's the one you choose to." No one could say who engraved it. No one ever admitted to knowing. But those who read it felt something shift inside them. Because it captured the lesson better than any manual ever could. Precision without conscience is just noise. And restraint, earned through discipline, is the highest form of control. In the years that followed, cadets at marksmanship schools across the services would hear two stories about Sergeant Eva Rostova. The first, about the shot that defied physics. The second, about the shot she never took. Together, they became the doctrine of silence and skill, the twin pillars of what the Corps called the human standard. And somewhere far away under another rising sun, Eva adjusted her scope once more. Steady hands, calm breath, quiet heart. Because legends might echo, but professionals, they just keep working. Change doesn't always march through doors. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing a faded uniform, leaving behind nothing but questions that never stop echoing. Months had passed since Sergeant Eva Rostova's name had last appeared on any official document. Her record was buried beneath classified tags and compartmentalized files. Her missions, half redacted, half myth, were scattered across digital archives only a few would ever read. But her influence, that was impossible to erase. It began in whispers again, just like before. A lieutenant at Quantico used her data sheets as an example of analog precision during a lecture on digital system redundancy. A Marine sniper instructor in Pendleton mentioned her calm under pressure to a class of recruits, telling them, "Don't look for heroics, look for consistency." And somewhere in the halls of the Naval Research Command, a line was quietly added to an internal memo about AI targeting protocols. No system replaces judgment. They didn't cite her by name. They didn't have to. Everyone already knew where it had started. At White Sands, the plaque beneath the brass casing had become a ritual stop for new arrivals. It wasn't mandatory, but everyone went. The rookies came curious, the veterans came thoughtful. Some just stood there for a minute and left without a word. Others lingered, eyes tracing the engraving as if it might reveal something hidden. The standard 2,500 meters, one round. This is what right looks like. And beneath that, in smaller text, someone had quietly added, "Perfection is not the shot you take. It's the one you choose not to." The two lines together had become a doctrine, the unspoken creed of the base. They didn't talk about it openly, but it was everywhere. In the way people handled their equipment, in the silence before a test firing, in the measured patience of engineers who now double-checked the math instead of trusting the system blindly. It was strange, really. All it took to recalibrate an entire culture was one disciplined act of restraint. General Caldwell noticed it too. He saw it in the briefings, fewer interruptions, more listening. He saw it in the data, higher hit percentages, lower system errors. But what struck him most wasn't the numbers, it was the quiet. Meetings used to be loud, full of jargon, full of men and women trying to outtalk each other. Now there were pauses, consideration, respect. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was deliberate. One morning, Caldwell walked into the lobby before a high-level inspection tour. He stopped, as he always did, before the display. The glass had a small fingerprint on it, probably from someone who'd leaned too close the night before. He took out a handkerchief and wiped it clean himself. No ceremony, just habit. His aide, a young captain, watched him curiously. "Sir, may I ask something?" Caldwell didn't look up. "Go ahead." "Why do you stop here every time?" The general's reflection looked back at him from the glass, older, grayer, but still proud. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because this isn't about a bullet," he said softly. "It's about humility, about remembering that no matter how much tech we build, skill and conscience still matter more." That's what she reminded us. He didn't say her name, but he didn't need to. The captain knew exactly who he meant. Across the base, in a small classroom where new range officers were being trained, Captain Monroe stood at a whiteboard. On it she'd written 3 words in black marker: silence, precision, character. "These," she said, "are the pillars of what we now call the human standard." Her tone was firm, not performative. This doctrine isn't about a single person, though it started with one. It's about recognizing that systems can guide you, but only integrity decides for you. A hand went up in the back. "Ma'am, is it true the Marine who started this standard disobeyed a direct order?" Monroe smiled faintly. She followed the only order that matters, the moral one. The room went quiet. She looked out across the faces of young officers who had grown up in the age of automation, where machines made decisions faster than people could breathe. "Don't mistake silence for weakness," she continued. "Sometimes silence is the strongest stand you can take." And far away, under a sky streaked with pale dawn, Eva Rostova was awake. She returned from her last deployment to a world that had already begun to move on without her. She didn't fight it. She never did. Her re-entry into the ordinary rhythm of life was quiet, just how she preferred it. A small apartment near the coast. Mornings spent running along empty shorelines. Afternoons repairing old rifles for local ranges. No insignia, no medals on the wall, just tools and silence. Sometimes she missed the desert, the discipline of purpose, the clean clarity of a mission, but she didn't crave the fight. She craved the focus, the stillness inside it. One morning she unpacked her old field notebook, the same one from White Sands, the same one the engineers had once laughed at. The pages were yellowed, edges curled, but the numbers were still there. Distances, angles, wind corrections. Her handwriting was exact, deliberate, patient. She ran her fingers across one line she'd written years ago, during training. "Control isn't holding your breath, it's knowing when to exhale." She smiled. That line had followed her through everything. Later that week, she visited a local veterans center, small, quiet, tucked between a laundromat and a gas station. They asked her to speak to a group of young Marines getting ready for deployment. She didn't want to at first. Public speaking wasn't her thing. But something in their request, humble, genuine, made her say yes. When she walked into the room, the chatter died immediately. Some recognized her, most didn't, but all of them felt something in her presence, that quiet authority that couldn't be faked. She stood in front of them, hands behind her back, eyes steady. No podium, No script, just honesty. I don't have speeches, she began softly. I don't like hearing myself talk, so I'll keep it short. A few smiles in the crowd. She waited for silence again. I was once told that technology makes soldiers better, that systems make us perfect. She shook her head slightly. They don't, people do, people who care enough to stay calm when it matters most. She looked around the room at the young faces, nervous, eager, some already scarred by loss. You'll be asked to make choices out there, she said. Hard ones. And sometimes you'll have to choose between doing what's easy, what's ordered, and what's right. A pause heavy, real. When that moment comes, she said, remember this, perfection isn't hitting your mark. It's hitting it without losing yourself. No applause, no grand ending, just silence. And in that silence, her words sank deep. A few weeks later, the director of the center printed a small quote on a plaque outside the briefing room. It read, "Discipline is quiet. Character doesn't echo. Integrity leaves no sound. S. Eva Rostova." Visitors often stopped to read it, even if they didn't know who she was. Some felt a small pull in their chest, that quiet, aching recognition of truth. At White Sands, a new batch of recruits stood before the brass casing for the first time. Their instructor, a young Marine captain, spoke softly. "You're looking at history," he said. "Not the kind that's written down, the kind that's lived." He tapped the glass lightly with a knuckle. She didn't change the world with noise. She did it with precision and conscience. Learn from that. One of the recruits raised his hand. "Sir, what happened to her?" The captain smiled faintly. "She went where professionals go after they've done everything right, back into silence." And somewhere, far from the deserts and the bases and the noise of human pride, Eva Rostova stood alone on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The wind pressed against her jacket, tugging gently at the ends of her hair. She watched the water churn, its rhythm endless, its surface deceptive. It reminded her of the mirage on the desert, calm on the outside, chaos beneath. She closed her eyes, took a slow, deliberate breath and exhaled. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Because she finally understood. The point had never been to be remembered. It had been to set a standard so strong it didn't need her name. Legends fade, standards endure. Years passed since that shot in the desert, since the silence that rewrote an entire base. But even as the details blurred, as names slipped from memory, as ranks changed, as technology marched on, the lesson refused to die. It had moved beyond uniforms now. You could feel it in unexpected places. In the way a young engineer recalculated instead of guessing. In the way a project lead paused before dismissing a quiet voice in a meeting. In the way a teacher corrected a student with patience instead of pride. None of them knew her name, but they were all living by her example. It started with a single article, one that wasn't supposed to exist. A defense journalist had stumbled across a brief mention of the Rostova standard in a training manual. No context, no record, no photo, just the phrase and a reference number. Curiosity became obsession. She followed the trail through declassified fragments, half-remembered testimonies, and one anonymous phone call from someone who had been there that day at White Sands. The story she published wasn't detailed. It couldn't be. But it was honest. It didn't talk about the shot itself. It talked about why it mattered. About a woman who proved that silence could command more respect than rank. About a leader who never asked to be one. The article spread like wildfire across forums, leadership circles, and professional networks. People didn't read it as a war story. They read it as a mirror. Business leaders quoted it in boardrooms. Teachers used it in classrooms. Doctors discussed it during ethics seminars. And somewhere deep in the internet, the comments filled with quiet gratitude. She reminded me that humility isn't weakness. She made me stop talking over my junior staff. She didn't shout, she proved. Meanwhile, back within the armed forces, something subtle was happening. The Rostova Standard was no longer just a story. It had become official doctrine. The Marine Corps marksmanship program introduced a new final exercise called the silent shot. No time limit, no audience, just the shooter, the wind, and one round. It wasn't scored by impact alone. Instructors graded composure, control, patience. Cadets were told, hit or miss, what matters is the silence before you fire. It was revolutionary in its simplicity, and for those who understood it, sacred. At Quantico, a visiting officer once asked an instructor, why base a whole lesson on someone who didn't even stay in the Corps? The instructor, an older Marine with gray hair and steady eyes, just smiled. She never left, he said, not really. Across the ocean, in a corporate training program in London, a leadership consultant held up a slide showing the same quote engraved beneath the brass casing at White Sands. This is what right looks like. He paused, then turned to the audience. This isn't about marksmanship, he said. It's about mastery. She didn't argue. She didn't fight for recognition. She simply did the job perfectly once. That's all it takes to change culture, one undeniable act done without noise. A woman in the front row raised her hand. But how do you keep doing that in a world that doesn't reward silence? He smiled gently. You don't do it for reward. You do it because it's who you are. Somewhere along the way, the phrase pulling a Rostova entered everyday speech. It no longer meant making a perfect shot. It meant doing the right thing quietly, doing it without needing applause. A firefighter in Arizona used it when a rookie refused credit for saving a family. A surgeon in Tokyo used it when a resident stayed late to fix a small error no one would have noticed. A teacher in Johannesburg used it to describe a student who protected a bullied classmate without saying a word. The world had found in her silence something universal, something deeply human. Meanwhile, Eva herself lived unaware of most of it. Her days were simple now, quiet mornings, long walks by the sea, repairing old rifles and teaching marksmanship at a small range that barely made enough to stay open. Sometimes the young shooters would ask, "You ever see real action?" She'd smile faintly, enough to know what not to glorify. They'd laugh, not realizing the weight behind the words. She didn't mind, she preferred it that way. Let the myth live on its own. Let the lesson matter more than the person. But sometimes, late at night, she'd sit on her porch overlooking the waves and feel the ghost of the desert wind against her face, hot, dry, unrelenting. And she'd remember the shot, the silence, the stare of that commander whose arrogance had melted into awe. She'd wonder if he'd ever found peace after that day. He had. Commander, now Colonel Davies, sat at his desk in a quiet Pentagon office, far from the desert. A small photo of that brass casing still sat on the corner of his desk. Its frame was worn, the glass slightly cracked from a move years ago. He wasn't the same man. He never would be. He'd become known for something rare in his department: patience, empathy, clarity. He mentored young officers with care, reminding them that leadership wasn't volume but presence. That respect wasn't commanded but earned. One evening, after reviewing a stack of reports, he leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "She changed me." He said it not as confession, but as gratitude. At White Sands, time had turned the facility into something unrecognizable: new systems, new personnel, new architecture. But the display case still stood in the lobby, untouched, unmoved. The brass had darkened slightly, taking on a warm, amber hue. The engraving beneath it was faint now, worn smooth by years of air conditioning and time. Yet somehow, it shone brighter than anything else in that sterile, digital world. Every day, dozens of people passed it without knowing its full story. But some stopped, usually the quiet ones, the ones who understood that greatness rarely shouts. They would stand there for a few seconds, staring at that single, simple artifact and feel something stir in their chest, that strange mix of humility and resolve. And they'd walk away a little different. In a boardroom in New York, a retired general addressed a group of young executives. He wasn't there to talk about warfare. He was there to talk about leadership. He clicked to the final slide of his presentation, an image of the same casing, glowing under glass. This, he said, was fired by a Marine sergeant named Eva Rostova. Some of you may have heard the story. Most of you haven't. That's the point. He let the room fall quiet. She didn't change the world by being loud. She changed it by being right once when everyone else doubted her. That's all it takes. One act of competence, one moment of grace, one refusal to compromise. He looked around the room, letting his words settle. You all want to make noise, he said. Try making history instead. Far from the world's attention, Eva sat in her workshop, the soft sound of rain tapping against the roof. She was cleaning her rifle again, not for war, not for competition, just to keep the ritual alive. The radio in the corner played an interview, a leadership podcast discussing the Rostova Standard. She smiled faintly as she listened, the host recounting the myth of the Marine sniper who had humbled an entire facility with silence. They spoke of her like she was a ghost. She didn't mind. Ghosts, she thought, don't need to be seen to be real. She reached over, turned off the radio and sat in the quiet. The rain outside grew heavier. The air smelled like metal and sea salt. And for a moment, she thought of all the people she'd never meet, the ones living better, thinking deeper, pausing longer because of one perfect shot and one impossible decision. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "That's enough." Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the dust of memory from the world. The kind of rain that cleans, that resets, that reminds you silence isn't emptiness, it's peace. And somewhere across the sea in the desert where it all began, the wind carried her name. Not shouted, not carved, just whispered. Like something eternal. How do you measure a life that never asked to be remembered? Some people leave monuments, some leave medals. But the rare ones, the ones who truly change the world, leave silence behind. A silence that reshapes the people who hear it. Eva Rostova never wrote a memoir. She never gave an interview. There were no documentaries, no official commendations, no grand farewell. She simply disappeared. The records list her final posting as detached service, status unspecified. To most, that meant retirement. To others, it meant she was still out there, somewhere, working in the shadows she'd always belonged to. But to those who truly understood her, it didn't matter where she went, because her presence had already outlived her. It began in small ways. A Marine recruit hesitating before pulling the trigger, remembering her lesson. A commander choosing to listen before barking orders. An engineer quietly fixing a flaw instead of pretending it wasn't there. Tiny acts, imperfect, human, real. But stitched together, they formed something sacred, a living echo of her standard. Somewhere along the way, her story slipped from myth into moral. No longer just about a sniper. It became about anyone who'd ever been underestimated. Anyone who'd ever been dismissed, ignored, or doubted, and still chose to do what was right. Years later, a museum was built on the grounds of the old White Sands testing facility. Most of it was glass and steel now, a monument to innovation and progress. But in one quiet corner, untouched by renovation, stood a small, preserved exhibit, a single bullet casing inside a clear cube. No lights, no digital display, just one plaque, aged but proud. It read, The Rostova Standard. 2,500 meters, one round. This is what right looks like. And beneath it, newly added, another line in fine engraving. Perfection is conscience, not calculation. Visitors came and went, families, soldiers, tourists, most with no idea who she was. But some lingered. Some felt it, that invisible weight of respect that needed no explanation. One afternoon, a young girl no more than 10 pressed her palm against the glass. Her father stood beside her, reading the plaque out loud. Who was she? The girl asked. The father hesitated, smiling faintly. Someone who didn't need to be seen to be great. The girl nodded thoughtfully, still staring at the casing. I want to be like her. He looked down at his daughter, pride soft in his eyes. Then start by being quiet, he said. Not everyone who's loud is strong. They walked away, hand in hand. The casing glimmered under the skylight, warm, eternal, unchanged. Far away, the ocean stretched endlessly under a gray sky. A small cottage sat alone on a cliff, weathered wood, chipped paint, and the smell of salt and memory. Inside, Eva Rostova sat by the window, a mug of coffee in her hands. Her hair was silver now, her eyes softer, but her posture still held that unmistakable steadiness, the bearing of someone who never broke, only bent with purpose. A letter sat unopened on the table beside her, a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. She already knew what it was. An invitation, a ceremony, a recognition long overdue. She didn't need to open it, she never would. Instead, she sipped her coffee and watched the horizon, the waves rising and collapsing like the rhythm of breath. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. Ma'am, I trained under your doctrine. I just wanted to say thank you. You saved lives you'll never know. She smiled faintly, set the phone down and whispered, That's enough. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the sea through the open window. It brushed against the pages of her old field notebook, still open on the desk. The paper fluttered to one page, yellowed with age. In her handwriting, one final note stood out. Control isn't power. It's peace. She closed the notebook gently, then stood, stretching her body slow but strong. As she walked outside, the sun broke through the clouds, thin beams scattering over the waves. She stepped to the edge of the cliff, the wind lifting her hair, the ocean roaring below. And for the first time in years, she whispered the words that had guided her all along. I didn't need to win, I just needed to be right. At that same moment, thousands of miles away, a cadet at Quantico recited the final creed of the marksmanship course, words now enshrined in training tradition. The weapon obeys the hand obeys the mind obeys the conscience, and conscience must never stay silent. When she finished, her instructor nodded quietly. Rostova's rule, he said. Every cadet knew it, every one of them felt it. Because the standard had outlived the shooter. The silence had become a voice. And the name had become a principle. As years turned into decades, the story fractured into legend. Some said she'd become a private instructor overseas. Others claimed she'd joined an intelligence unit, so secret it didn't exist on paper. A few whispered she died quietly, buried without honors, just how she would have wanted. No one knew for certain. No one ever would. But that was the beauty of it. Because legends don't need endings. They just need to mean something. And so her story remained, passed in fragments, in echoes, in quiet admiration. Not in the books of war, but in the hearts of those who understood what war really cost. Not in the halls of power, but in the small spaces between decisions, where morality whispers before pride can speak. And every time someone paused before acting. Every time a soldier steadied their breath before pulling the trigger. Every time a leader chose integrity over noise. Her legacy lived again. In the end, no one built a statue for Sergeant Eva Rostova. No one needed to, because she had left something greater than a monument. She left a mirror for everyone who ever wondered what right looks like when the world stops watching. The camera would fade here, slow, deliberate, to the sound of the ocean wind. And in that soft, cinematic silence, her final truth would echo like a heartbeat across generations. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.